Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping straight back into the dense, monsoon-soaked jungles of 1944. We're exploring a profound piece of military history, drawing directly from Robert Lyman's defining work, End of Empire. Now, this isn't just a simple recount of distant battles. We're looking at meticulous examination of a campaign where the sheer survival of India, under immense wartime strain, truly hung in the balance. We're talking about facing down an invading force of nearly 100,000 men. We'll be digging into the strategies, the devastating human cost, and the profound military lessons of a moment when the tide of war in Asia stood on an absolute precipice. Let's get started. Okay, let's dive into this. What if the fate of Asia turned on one desperate year? 1944 was absolutely that defining hinge point. By this time, Japanese forces had already overrun vast tracts of Southeast Asia and Burma. But to secure that dominance, the Japanese 15th Army looked toward India. Imagine, for a moment, a massive invading force crossing some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. Their goal wasn't just to win a tactical engagement. No, they aimed to trigger a massive, widespread rebellion, sever vital Allied supply routes, and ultimately shatter imperial power at its most vulnerable edge. The stakes literally could not have been higher. Now, there was an incredibly stark contrast between the Japanese ambition and the reality on the ground. The Japanese offensive, which is often remembered as their March on Delhi, was built on this bold, almost desperate strategic dream. They honestly believed that a sudden, intense pressure at the frontier would cause the British defenses to just fracture and the political center in India to collapse. But the Allied reality? Vastly different. Following earlier setbacks in 1942, the British 14th Army, led by General Bill Slim, alongside some incredibly formidable Indian forces, had fundamentally rebuilt. They reorganized, adapted to jungle warfare, and they were waiting. They were anchored in a defensive posture that the Japanese had severely, critically underestimated. Act 1. The Gamble and the Crossing. You see, pushing into the Burma-India frontier was an immense, staggering gamble. The geography alone, we're talking towering ridges and deep, turbulent rivers, was just as formidable an adversary as the Allied armies waiting on the other side. A river crossing of this magnitude wasn't merely a tactical maneuver. It was a massive strategic commitment, meaning once the Japanese forces crossed the Chindwin River, they passed the point of no return. They essentially tied themselves to an offensive deep in hostile territory, where their survival became entirely dependent on speed and an ever-stretching supply line. If they slowed down for even a moment, the jungle and the enemy would simply consume them. The progression of this Japanese advance followed a very tragic, unyielding timeline. It begins with the ambitious decision to invade, right? Followed by the immense physical and strategic commitment of actually crossing the Chindwin. But as they pushed deeper, they slammed into stubborn, entrenched resistance, which led straight into exhausting siege warfare. Eventually, the sheer distance, the brutal climate, and the impassable terrain really began to work against them, culminating in a devastating logistical collapse. The environment itself was literally draining their strength, day by agonizing day. Act 2. The human landscape and the unconventional war. War, as we know, doesn't occur in a vacuum. It ravages everything it touches. And this brilliantly illustrates a key reality. The hills and jungles of this campaign were not empty spaces. They were the ancestral homelands of local communities, most notably the Naga people. This invasion fundamentally altered civilian life, completely destroying food systems and transforming ordinary villages into bitter, bloody battlegrounds. It's a vital reminder for us today. Terrain is lived territory. The war absolutely devastated these local communities, pulling them entirely against their will into a brutal struggle for survival. Alongside that heartbreaking civilian toll, the very nature of the fighting had to evolve. Classical battlefield models, completely useless here. Enter the Chindits. These were specialized British and Indian forces who were absolute masters of unconventional, long-range penetration behind enemy lines. Their mission was to drop deep, harness jungle mobility, and relentlessly harass the Japanese rear supply routes. To pull this off required a massive shift toward air support and reconnaissance. The Chindits really proved that in such an unforgiving theater, continuous innovation and adaptation weren't just helpful, they were absolutely decisive. Act 3. The sieges begin. Kohima and Imphal. So those sweeping movements through the jungle, they soon ground to a violent halt. The campaign concentrated into this claustrophobic, desperate conflict, and the contrasting realities of these sieges became painfully clear. Under the command of General Mutagachi, the Japanese forces applied immense, continuous frontal pressure, but they were plagued by severe supply shortages and dangerously stretched logistics. Conversely, look at the Allied defenders at Kohima and Imphal. They relied on defense in depth. Their survival depended entirely on an intricate logistical system holding up. We're talking continuous air supply lifelines dropping food and ammunition from the sky, alongside vital medical support to keep the wounded alive. The defense of Kohima, which was a tiny but incredibly vital hinge point on the road network, required just immense human endurance. Defending troops faced nonstop shelling, profound isolation, and agonizing uncertainty. At one stage, and this is truly hard to fathom, bitter hand-to-hand combat was being fought across the literal width of a local district commissioner's tennis court. It's madness. A siege, you see, goes far beyond physical trenches or walls. It's the ultimate test of human willpower under extreme pressure. The defenders had to hold their ground just long enough for the broader Allied military machine to respond.
Act 4. The turning point in Asia.
The tension finally reaches its climax. The desperate stands at Kohima and Imphal would become the sheer anvils upon which the Japanese offensive was ultimately broken. Kohima served as the vital gate, the hinge point controlling access, while Imphal was the vast, trapped interior. Both saw bitter, close-quarters combat and grueling attrition. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the Allied strategy functioned in its grim reality. They succeeded at Imphal not by immediately eliminating the danger, but simply by surviving. They endured until the overextended Japanese offensive simply collapsed under its own heavy weight. And that brings us to the core military lesson derived from Lyman's analysis. Bravery on the battlefield is essential, for sure, but it's never enough on its own. The Japanese soldiers fought with terrifying valor, but valor cannot conjure rations or ammunition out of thin air. Great offensives require relentless sustainment. Without food, without medicine, and without resupply, even the absolute most courageous armies cannot fight. Logistics quite simply dictate the boundaries of war.
Act 5. Armageddon and the collapse.
With their momentum broken and supplies totally exhausted, the Japanese army faced a total, tragic ruin. The campaign devolved into what can honestly only be described as Armageddon. The anatomy of this collapse is a tragic cascade of events. First, the offensive shatters against those resolute Allied defensive lines. Then, the Japanese commanders, bound by very rigid doctrine, stubbornly refused to disengage and retreat in time. Because of that, stranded soldiers were left to suffer horrible exhaustion, rampant disease, and starvation. Finally, the invasion ends in absolute strategic ruin. Ignoring material reality doomed the entire offensive, which ultimately paved the way for the Allied reconquest of Burma. Finally, the realities of war. As we step back to view this campaign in its entirety, we really have to reflect on the profound final takeaways. This history teaches us about the truly heavy cost of empire, the complex dynamics of coalition warfare, and the harsh, unforgiving realities of military conflict. So the crucial point is this: bold strategy is meaningless without the foundation to support it. Strategy has to be perfectly matched by meticulous supply lines, accurate intelligence, and deeply realistic planning. Furthermore, we must acknowledge the legacy of the Indian Army. Their immense contribution and sheer endurance were absolutely central to the Allied victory in the East. They rebuilt themselves to hold the line when the defense of their homeland mattered most.
We leave you with this lingering thought today. The 1944 invasion of India was a monumental clash of empires, decided not just by bullets, but by bread, medicine, and sheer endurance. Will history properly remember that even the greatest courage, when entirely stripped of logistics, is merely a march towards strategic ruin? Thank you for joining us for this explainer.